I'm going to talk today about energy and climate. And that might seem a bit surprising because my full-time work at the Foundation is mostly about vaccines and seeds, about the things that we need to invent and deliver to help the poorest 2 billion live better lives. But energy and climate are extremely important to these people. In fact, more important than to anyone else on the planet. The climate getting worse means that many years their crops won't grow. There'll be too much rain, not enough rain. Things will change in ways that their fragile environment simply can't support. And that leads to starvation, it leads to uncertainty, it leads to unrest. So the climate changes will be terrible for them. Also, the price of energy is very important to them. In fact, if you could pick just one thing to lower the price of, to reduce poverty, by far you would pick energy. Now, the price of energy has come down over time. Advanced civilization is based on advances in energy. The coal revolution fueled the Industrial Revolution, and even in the 1900s, we've seen a very rapid decline in the price of electricity. That's why we have refrigerators, air conditioning. We can make modern materials and do so many things. And so we're in a wonderful situation with electricity in the rich world. But as we make it cheaper, and let's go for making it twice as cheap, we need to meet a new constraint. And that constraint has to do with CO2. CO2 is warming the planet. And the equation on CO2 is actually a very straightforward one. If you sum up the CO2 that gets emitted, that leads to a temperature increase. And that temperature increase leads to some very negative effects. The effects on the weather, perhaps worse, the indirect effects in that the natural ecosystems can't adjust to these rapid changes, and so you get ecosystem collapses. Now, the exact amount of how you map from a certain increase in of CO2 to what temperature will be and where the positive feedbacks are, there's some uncertainty there, but not very much. And there's certainly uncertainty about how bad those effects will be, but they will be extremely bad. I asked the top scientists on this several times, do we really have to get down to near zero? Can't we just, cut it in half or a quarter? And the answer is that until we get near to zero, the temperature will continue to rise. And so that's a big challenge. It's very different than saying, we're a 12-foot high truck trying to get under a 10-foot bridge and we can just sort of squeeze under. This is something that has to get to zero. Now, we put out a lot of carbon dioxide every year, over 26 billion tons. For each American, it's about 20 tons. For people in poor countries, it's less than 1 ton. It's an average about 5 tons for everyone on the planet. And somehow we have to make changes that will bring that down to zero. It's been constantly going up. It's only various economic changes that have even flattened it at all. So we have to go from rapidly rising to falling and falling all the way to zero. This equation has four factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero. And that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra. But let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. But there we see an increase of about 1.3. The second factor is the world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. But there we see an increase of about 1.3.
Hi everyone, I'm Spiro, back with another update concerning the coronavirus outbreak. In my recent report, we took an inside look at Event 201, which was a pandemic exercise that simulated a coronavirus outbreak which killed 65 million people. The simulation took place shortly before the actual coronavirus outbreak had occurred. Now in this report, I covered how Section 4 of the simulation was perhaps the most shocking, as the participants of the exercise, which included representatives from the United Nations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the media, vaccine manufacturers, major banks, and the Chinese and American CDC, just to name a few, discussed how it was critically important to control news and information, especially on social media. Now, one of the members, who works for the Monetary Authority of Singapore, even suggested it's time for governments to jail those who post fake news.
But one thing we haven't spoken about, and I'm wondering whether it's time to talk about this, is a step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news, right? Some of us, these new regulations that come in place about how we deal with fake news. And maybe this is a time for us to showcase some cases where we are able to bring forward some bad actors and leave it before the courts to decide whether they have actually spread some fake news.
Now, what is fake news? And who decides what the facts are? And who fact-checks the fact-checkers? Now, another member of the simulation panel, who is the Global Chief Operating Officer of Edelman, suggested that social media companies themselves need to be the arbiters of truth.
We're at a moment where the social media platforms have to step forward and recognize the moment to assert that they're a technology platform and not a broadcaster is over. They, in fact, have to be a participant in broadcasting accurate information and partnering with the scientific and health communities to counterweight, if not flood the zone of accurate information, because to put the genie back in the bottle of the misinformation and disinformation is nigh impossible.
The Event 201 panel also agreed that there needed to be a centralized source of information, which would disseminate the official story, in essence becoming the Ministry of Truth. Now, the panel decided that the World Health Organization would be most suitable for this task. Now, Event 201 even created fake news reports as part of their exercise, talking about how fake news threatened governments and how social media companies were removing content and how some governments were even shutting down the internet entirely.
Countries are reacting in different ways as to how best to manage the overwhelming amounts of dis and misinformation circulating over the internet. In some cases, limited internet shutdowns are being implemented to quell panic.
Now, just as the simulation itself seems to eerily predict the coronavirus outbreak, we're beginning to see other scenarios in the simulation come to fruition, such as travel bans, a negative impact on the economy, as well as censorship, as Facebook, Twitter, and Google, which owns YouTube, have all vowed to stop, quote, misinformation. Let's take a quick moment to compare some news reports. Let's start with one from the simulation.
Alarming news emerging from social media companies today about the CAPS pandemic. Twitter and Facebook are reporting they've identified and deleted a disturbing number of accounts dedicated to spreading disinformation about the outbreak.
And now let's hear one from the real world.
As we continue to monitor the deadly coronavirus outbreak, social media accounts are also spreading misinformation about the deadly virus.
As Axios reports, tech platforms including Facebook, Twitter, and Google are now racing to contain false information, much of which violates their content policies.
Do we really want social media companies deciding for us what is and what is not misinformation? Can't we, the people, discern truth from non-truth for ourselves? Shouldn't we have that choice? I see this as nothing more than a move to censor and control the narrative as part of the information war. Just last night, Zero Hedge had their Twitter account permanently banned from the social media platform. Many speculate that this was due to Zero Hedge's coverage of the coronavirus outbreak, which often countered the mainstream narrative. Now, just before Zero Hedge was banned, they published a controversial article suggesting that the coronavirus contained HIV insertions, implying that the virus was man-made or had been altered in some way, stoking fears that the virus was actually a bioweapon. Shortly after Zero Hedge was banned, they published an article disclosing why they believe that they were banned from Twitter. A writer from BuzzFeed filed a complaint with Twitter against Zero Hedge and wrote an article claiming that Zero Hedge had doxed a Chinese scientist and falsely accused him of creating the coronavirus as a bioweapon. So, according to Zero Hedge, they were banned for what Twitter deemed as harassment for publishing the scientist's name and contact information, despite the fact that the scientist's information was already publicly available. I encourage everyone on Twitter to message Twitter support and Jack, who is the CEO or owner of Twitter, and demand that they immediately reinstate Zero Hedge's Twitter account, or you can retweet my message to them. Now, censorship is not the answer. In my opinion, we need all the information we can get our hands on so we can determine for ourselves what is actually taking place. We cannot simply rely on social media companies, the governments, or the corporate media and their controllers, or even the UN and the World Health Organization to decide what the truth is for us.